The Federal Bureau of Investigation was founded on the 26th of July, 1908, and as most of us know, they've conducted several secret operations of different kinds over the following decades. Now, many of these secret files have been declassified, and the public can learn what these operations were about and who was involved. Operation Solo started as a means for the FBI to keep track of members of the Communist Party in the US, but it soon became much more than that, as the agency started investigating Soviet leaders between 1858 and 1977. While the operation was the brainchild of the FBI, the groundwork was conducted by three different people: Morris Childs, his wife Ava, and Jack Childs, his brother. Morris seemed to be the natural choice for this role, since he'd been a member of the Communist Party in the US, known by the acronym CPUSA, for many years. Hence, he was given the title of advisor to the International Department of the Central Committee, and awarded the Order of the Red Banner, which is bestowed upon those who have delivered impeccable service. Morris was trusted wholly by Soviet leaders, and at no point, while he was clandestinely working for the FBI, did they suspect that he was anything but loyal. He started gathering information on the Soviet Union's relationship with other communist countries, like China and Cuba. He was given the codename 58 when he, Ava, and Jack started to feel ever more uncomfortable with the Communist Party's ideals, and the three were quickly brought in by the FBI, knowing that they could be an invaluable tool to an operation such as Solo. They were given the title of FBI agents and traveled to these countries with no restrictions, since they were all trusted by each country's government as communists. Morris had close contact with Soviet leaders, and Ava remained at his side most of the time. Her job was to provide him with cover stories and alibis, while also transcribing different documents and messages that Morris received. When they got their hands on secret documents, they would make handwritten copies. These were then taped to their bodies before they flew back to the US, and once there, all of this valuable information would be handed over. As for Jack, he was responsible for overseeing the transfer of assets from the Soviet Union to CPUSA, and he reported that as much as $28 million had exchanged hands while he was monitoring the situation. With this information readily available, the US government virtually always knew what was going on in the Kremlin. They knew exactly which plans were being put in place and what the economic situation in the Soviet Union, China, and other communist countries was. But they also had a unique insight into what the Soviet leaders were concerned about. Furthermore, any vulnerability in the Soviet government was laid bare for the US government to see, and hence they were able to take advantage of those weaknesses and turn them into an even bigger advantage. All in all, Morris made 52 trips back and forth between the US and several communist countries, and by the time he was done, it had taken a serious physical toll on him. But the information that he was able to provide to the US was of the utmost importance. For example, he reported that the Cuban government had gotten word of the US's ideas to overthrow Fidel Castro in Cuba. This report delayed the invasion until John F. Kennedy took over from Dwight Eisenhower. And when Kennedy decided to forge ahead with the plan, despite Morris's warning, the result was the Bay of Pigs invasion. When all was said and done, both Morris and Jack received the Presidential Medal of Freedom, and in doing so, became the first two spies to ever be decorated in two different and very opposing countries. Most people are familiar with the rumor that Lucille Ball, one of the stars of the hit TV show I Love Lucy, once inadvertently picked up radio broadcasts in her tooth fillings, and that she then used this ability to help the US spy on Japan. For the uninitiated, it started in 1942, while the Second World War was still in full swing. Lucille was in the midst of filming a movie one day, and she was driving home when she became aware that she was hearing music, and that it was emanating from her teeth. She believed her tooth fillings had somehow managed to broadcast music from a nearby radio station, and claimed that later on she also started picking up Morse code messages. She reported the strange event to the FBI, and according to legend, this information helped them track down and arrest a Japanese spy who was conducting operations from a tool shed while pretending to be working as a gardener. This story has never been proven or confirmed by the FBI, but one fact that is certain: is that the agency did indeed have a file on Lucille, and it's now been declassified. In 1953, 11 years later, she was the subject of an investigation by the House Un-American Activities Committee, since she'd admitted to registering as a communist back in 1936. But when she was questioned about the decision, she claimed she'd only done so because it was the will of her grandfather who'd fallen gravely ill. She claimed to have never been an active member of the party, and that she actually had no ties to the organization. This seemed like a reasonable explanation, and the issue was dropped by the committee, but not by J. Edgar Hoover, the director of the FBI. He ordered that the investigation into Lucille's activities continue, and that her husband, Desi Arnaz, also be included in their inquiries. The declassified file shows that the FBI knew Lucille was slated by the communist newspaper, the Daily Worker, as being a vocal opponent of then-Senator Joseph McCarthy, along with a long list of other celebrities. The paper alleged that she was open about this stance at first, but that she then decided that it would be better if she didn't speak about it openly. But Arnaz was also soon on the FBI's radar. He had performed in a show that gained sponsorship from the Hollywood Independent Citizens Committee of the Arts, which was seen by the FBI as a threat since they believed it to be a communist front of some kind. The performance was attended by FBI agents, and the declassified file contains notes about Arnaz's performance, other people in attendance, and the activities that they observed while at the show. The case for Lucille being a communist was only bolstered in 1973, when a Hollywood writer claimed that a communist meeting had taken place at her house. The writer claimed to have attended the meeting, but also made sure to mention that he never saw Lucille there, and that she was never in attendance. In the end, it seemed that Lucille's explanation for joining the Communist Party was indeed truthful, and that she wasn't actively involved in their activities after registering to vote as a communist. Nikola Tesla is considered to be one of the most influential inventors of all time. He was responsible for the creation of alternate current, the Tesla coil, neon lighting, and remote controls, and was instrumental in developing the radio as well as the hydroelectric power plant that's located at Niagara Falls. But the FBI started investigating him and his inventions when he made mention of the fact that he was working on developing a device that he called a death ray. The agency was concerned that the ray could be used for nefarious purposes, especially if its design was to become known to the Soviet Union or anyone else who opposed the US government. They were also concerned about Tesla's ability to keep the design secret, since he'd started becoming ever more eccentric as he neared the end of his life, sometimes being seen tending to pigeons in his hotel room or being visibly repulsed by women who were wearing earrings. Most important of all, though, was the fact that if he were successful in creating the ray, it could be used by the US as a powerful weapon against their enemies. And so after Tesla passed away in 1943, agents descended on his hotel room and confiscated most of the papers that they could find. This resulted in a lot of speculation and conspiracy theories, as some people believed he'd actually finished the death ray and that the government now had it in its possession, a fact that made most of the public very uncomfortable. His nephew, Sava Kosanovic, hurried to the inventor's room as soon as he got word of his passing, but by the time he got there, Tesla's remains had already been taken away, and he noted that one particular black notebook, which contained some pages on the government, was missing, along with most of his papers. 2 days later, the rest of his personal belongings were seized by the Office of Alien Property. A specialist named John G. Trump was asked to study the papers, and after 3 days, he concluded that there were no real threats to the government, since Tesla's notes were mostly theoretical or speculative at best. The papers concerning the death ray were sent to Dayton, Ohio, specifically the Patterson Air Force Base. There, Brigadier General L.C. Craigie was tasked with testing Tesla's theories on the ray, and several experiments were conducted. The outcome of these experiments remains unknown, as the results were never published and the project was eventually abandoned. But the mystery surrounding the ray didn't end there. Following the discontinuation of the project, Tesla's papers on the subject mysteriously disappeared. Some of these papers have now been released to the public, but much of the information has been redacted or left out completely, only further fueling the imaginations of conspiracy theorists, many of whom still believe that the ray was indeed developed and possibly used by the US government. Abbie Hoffman is remembered as being one of the Chicago Seven, a group of men who were put on trial by the US government after they were accused of crossing a border to incite a riot, taking part in anti-Vietnam War protests and conspiracy. Hoffman was monitored by the FBI for several years, and the result was that his FBI file ended up being around 13,000 pages long, with one of the more entertaining parts being when he started publishing government records that were not meant for the public eye. It started in 1969, when Hoffman was in the process of writing a book called Woodstock Nation, and somehow the FBI got word that it contained anti-American sentiments. Needless to say, this was seen as unacceptable, and they set about doing everything they could to stop it from seeing the light of day. They managed to get a hold of a rough copy of the book, which detailed his personal experience at that year's famous Woodstock Festival, which doesn't sound like it would pose any kind of threat. But someone tipped them off that it contained a chapter on constructing explosive devices. While it's a very bad idea to publish this kind of information in any situation, the FBI learned that he'd gotten the recipe for the devices from the US Army's field manual, and they felt that Hoffman would be violating federal law by bringing up this knowledge to the public. But they were forced to end their investigation when it was determined that the manual had been declassified and that it was therefore accessible to the public at any time. Hoffman could not be charged with any crime, and that section of the FBI's inquiry was quickly shut down. Woodstock Nation was published and released just a few months later, while the Chicago Seven were still on trial, during which Hoffman made fun of the proceedings, and in doing so, started currying favor with the press and the public who were following the case. All 7 members of the group were found guilty and sentenced accordingly, but they appealed their sentences, all of which were overturned. But the FBI was far from done with Hoffman in particular, as they charged him once more in 1974, claiming he'd been in possession of an illegal substance. Hoffman was adamant that he never possessed the substance and that he was being framed by the police. He appeared in court and was given bail, after which he decided to go on the run. He had his face altered through plastic surgery and for 6 years managed to evade capture. In 1980, his time as a fugitive came to an end when he decided to hand himself over, and ended up serving just 4 months on the illegal substance charge, instead of the 3 years that he faced originally. Walt Disney was responsible for bringing joy into the houses of millions of people while he was alive, and his legacy lives on today as one of the most influential figures in children's entertainment. But not many people are aware that at one point in his life, he worked closely with the FBI, and that his file, which was put together by the agency, has now been declassified. Its contents revealed that Disney worked for the government as a spy in an effort to undermine union workers that he had employed. It all started in 1941 when animators decided to go on strike, and Disney appeared before the Healthcare Credit Union Association, where he accused several of the animators working for him of being communists. And so he was recruited by the agency to keep tabs on these workers. In return, he was given permission to film on property that was owned by the FBI, which at the same time ensured that he was kept safe from any resulting threats. 13 years later, Disney was given the title of Contact of Special Agent in Charge, and for the next 12 years, he worked as an informant for the FBI, making them aware of any workers in his employ that may have had ties to communism. He passed away in 1966, and at that point, the public was blissfully unaware that he'd been employed by the agency. But now, Disney's FBI file has been declassified, and his true involvement with the government is no longer a secret. It's now known that Disney and Hoover became fast friends while they were working together, and that the HUAC created a blacklist of Hollywood personalities that they saw as a threat to the US government for different reasons. Union leaders claimed that Disney animators decided to go on strike after he decided to fire them for being involved with activism, but Disney fired back, claiming he decided to terminate their employment because they'd been influenced by communism. The HUAC sided with Disney, and before long, animator David Hilberman's name was mentioned. It was speculated that he was some kind of anti-government radical when Disney learned that he had no interest in religion and that he had at some point studied direction at the Moscow Art Theater. Disney gave the FBI permission to conduct meetings at Disneyland, and for agents and their families to spend time there at their leisure. He'd become so enamored with the agency that he decided to dedicate an episode of the Mickey Mouse Club show to the FBI, but this would serve more than one purpose. Disney felt that doing this would help children understand that there were many employment opportunities in the country, other than the mundane, and that they could contribute to what he called the American endeavor. At first, the idea was rejected, but in 1958, the narrative was finally broadcast. It focused on the character of a 13-year-old boy who was a member of the Mickey Mouse Club. He got the opportunity to meet J. Edgar Hoover, had his fingerprints taken, and watched as FBI agents unloaded their weapons at a mock-up of a bank robber, Babyface Nelson, who helped John Dillinger escape from prison. But the original script was altered by the FBI, since Disney initially included a scene where the boy was given a firearm to inspect, but the agency felt that this would be inappropriate and insisted that the scene be removed before the filming would commence. People who are familiar with the phrase McCarthyism know that it refers to ex-US Senator Joseph McCarthy, who accused many people of being communists after the end of World War II. Many of those who were mentioned either lost their jobs or were blacklisted, despite there being no evidence that they were in any way associated with communism. Hence, in modern times, the phrase McCarthyism refers to a process where someone is accused of something without any incriminating evidence being presented, or where unfair investigative tactics are used to try and prove that someone is guilty of a crime that they didn't commit. When the war was finally over, the US became gripped by a fear of communism called the Red Scare, and virtually no sector of commerce was beyond suspicion. It comes as no surprise then that the film industry was being scoured for communists in case they decided to include their ideals and propaganda in movies or TV shows that were being made at the time. Hence, during the late 1940s and 50s, many people involved in the film industry were investigated by government agencies such as the FBI, one of which was the famous comedian Charlie Chaplin. This was no small matter, since anyone who was accused of being aligned with communism was placed on a blacklist and was unlikely to find work in Hollywood again. At the time, Chaplin had become a hugely influential character in the industry, which was an alarming situation in the eyes of the FBI. It would later come to light when Chaplin's FBI file was declassified that they had been collecting data on him from as early as 1922, since he was seen as a subversive and revolutionary. Furthermore, he hailed from London, England, and despite living in the US for much of his life, never attempted to become a citizen. The agency had also grown suspicious of him since he didn't conform to the cultural norms of the time. It was decided that Chaplin had to be investigated, since the FBI felt that many of his films contained communist propaganda, and hence they assumed that he had ties to communism, but they were having a hard time proving these theories. In an effort to learn more about Chaplin, they bugged his hotel room with listening devices and contacted MI5 in the UK in an attempt to glean as much information about him as possible, including what his real name was. They'd gotten word that his birth name was Israel Thornstein and that he was actually born in France, not England. But they were told that Chaplin's real name was Charles Spencer Chaplin. But strangely, MI5 was unable to find his birth records and hence agreed that he may have been born in a different country or that he had changed his name at some point in his life. At one point, it was speculated that he came from Jewish heritage, something that was bad news for anyone in the film industry at the time, since many of those who were blacklisted were known to be Jewish, such as the Hollywood 10. This investigation would continue for many years until 1958, when it was finally decided that Chaplin was in no way a threat to the US government. They felt that he was likely a communist sympathizer, but that he wouldn't act on those beliefs. Famous author Truman Capote is remembered for his novella Breakfast at Tiffany's, which was later turned into a film by the same name starring Audrey Hepburn, George Peppard, and Mickey Rooney, among many others that he authored. But not many people know that he was investigated by the FBI, and that his file, which contains over 100 pages of information, is now available to the public. Capote was just one of many authors who were being investigated after it was found that they supported the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. The committee had been set up in New York and Canada after it was established by Robert Tabor in 1960 and sought to provide support to the Cuban Revolution. Among the other authors that were being investigated were Allen Ginsberg, Gore Vidal, and Norman Mailer, all of whom were thought to have had associations with the FPCC. On the 6th of April 1960, the FBI started to grow concerned when they came across an ad in the New York Times in which the FPCC challenged the US government's stance against the Cuban Revolution. But 3 years later, the group would be dismantled when the American public started to become ever more paranoid over the communist threat, and after then-President John F. Kennedy's life was ended by Lee Harvey Oswald, who was believed to be a communist sympathizer since he defected to the Soviet Union in 1959 before eventually returning to the US. At the time, Capote was in the midst of writing his nonfiction novel titled In Cold Blood, which was published in 1966. It was a detailed account of the investigation of the Clutter family, who had their lives ended in November of 1959 in Holcomb, Texas. Two former prisoners, Perry Smith and Richard Hancock, were eventually found to be the ones responsible for the crime, and after being found guilty, were both executed in 1965. But before they were even named as suspects, Capote heard about the tragedy and traveled to Kansas to get as many details as possible. He and his close friend Harper Lee conducted interviews with witnesses and spoke to investigators who worked on the case, all the while taking notes of everything they learned. The result was what many people still consider to be the very first nonfiction novel, and when it was released, it was an instant success. It told of how the two criminals hatched their plan to make a big score by robbing the family's farmhouse, as well as Smith and Hancock's attempts to evade the law. They fled to New Mexico after carrying out the crime, but soon ran out of money, and after being forced to cash several bad checks, they had no choice but to return to the US. Once there, they were apprehended, and it came to light that the two robbers mistakenly believed that Herb Cutter kept all of his money in a safe in the house, making it the perfect target. But in reality, Cutter only used checks instead of cash, and when the robbery was concluded, the pair fled with just $50 in their pockets. After their capture, the two turned on each other, with Smith claiming that Hancock had ended the family's lives, but Hancock claimed that Smith was responsible for ending at least two of their lives. In the end, Capote was found to not have any real ties to communism, and the investigation into his life was ended, but not before his file was filled with as many as 100 pages, much of which was mere speculation rather than fact. According to the FBI memorandum on famous author Helen Keller, the agency never conducted a full-scale investigation into her life, but they have admitted to collecting information on her life since they believe that she was a communist sympathizer. Helen was born in Tuscumbia, Alabama in 1880, but her life took a tragic turn when she contracted a mysterious illness, thought to possibly have been scarlet fever when she was just 19 months old. As a result, she was left blind and deaf for the rest of her life, which would be a massive hurdle for most people. But after she was examined by Alexander Graham Bell in 1886, he decided to send her to a 20-year-old teacher named Anne Sullivan. Sullivan was employed by the Perkins Institute for the Blind, which was based in Boston, Massachusetts, and was under the direction of Bell's son-in-law. Bell knew that Sullivan was an amazing teacher, and his hope was that she could teach Helen to read and write. Just a few months later, Helen had learned to identify different objects by touch, and then learned to spell these objects' names using her fingers in the palm of her hand. She was then taught to read raised words that had been written on pieces of cardboard, and before long, she was writing complete sentences, something that she'd not been able to do for the first 6 years of her life. In 1890, she had started to learn to read Braille, but that's when her first truly daunting challenge began: learning to speak. She relocated to a school for the deaf, where her teacher, Sarah Fuller, took her under her wing. She then learned to lip read, and before long became an excellent student. She first studied at the Wright Humason School for the Deaf, and at the age of 16, attended the Cambridge School for Young Ladies, which was located in Massachusetts. Following this, she attended Radcliffe College, from where she graduated in 1904. But she would soon come under the US government's radar, after she started sympathizing with the striking mill workers in Little Falls, New York, and writing about civil rights. The FBI then started gathering information on Helen, and in her file, which is no longer secret, the first page contains a letter to J. Edgar Hoover, asking for information on funding that was being provided to state institutions for the blind. It also notes that Keller was a signatory on an American Friends of Spanish Democracy petition to end the arms embargo against Spain in 1938. The FBI considered this group to be distinctly un-American and speculated that it may have been a front for a communist organization. Hence, they started gathering as much information on Keller as possible in case she really did have ties to communism. When news about the petition was published in the Daily Worker, a communist newspaper, it raised many eyebrows, especially since Helen's name was mentioned. Her name would appear in the paper once again when it was reported that she would be a speaker at a memorial meeting for the Friends of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, which was a group of Americans that fought for the Republicans in Spain during the 1930s. The Special Committee on Un-American Activities considered this group to be a communist front, and once again, Helen was on the FBI spotlight. But no proof was ever found that she was involved in communism, and her file was sealed when this finally became apparent. It'll come as no surprise that the FBI created a massive file on the notorious businessman and gangster Al Capone. It consists of over 2,400 pages detailing most of his life from when he became a notorious gangster in Chicago to the end of it in Florida. In 1930, Capone was branded by the US government as public enemy number 1, having become one of the most dangerous gangsters the country had ever seen. But his life of crime started long before that when he was still a young boy. He became involved with the street gang, and when he landed his first real job, it was at a saloon owned by mobster Johnny Torrio. He started work there as a dishwasher, but soon became a bartender, and eventually started carrying out jobs for Torrio along with his fellow gangsters. When he got married and had a child, he knew he had to make a lot of money to support his family, and so he took on more dangerous jobs. He eventually relocated to Chicago, where he became Torrio's right-hand man. Torrio then relocated back to New York, leaving Capone in charge of the gang's operations in Chicago, and before long he'd become a very wealthy and feared man. He became somewhat of an icon that spoke freely to the press despite being accused of some heinous crimes. He started dressing in vibrant colored suits and seemed to truly enjoy all of the attention he was getting. But all this changed on the 14th of February, 1929, the day that the St. Valentine's Day massacre took place. A group of gangsters, thought to be under Capone's orders, rounded up 7 of rival gangster Bugs Moran's people while dressed as police officers and proceeded to end their lives without any mercy. This event shifted the public's perception of organized crime, and newspapers started publishing far less flattering articles about the crime boss. President Herbert Hoover announced that Capone was now the government's main target, and he was charged with bootlegging. Capone declined to appear in court, stating he'd fallen ill while in Miami, but the FBI traveled to his house and found him to be in perfect health. He was making bets at racetracks and had gone on vacation when he claimed to be bedridden. He was found in contempt of court and summarily arrested. He posted bail but was soon back in prison when he was arrested for carrying a concealed weapon. While he was in prison, Capone's bootlegging businesses were raided, but it would be a lesser charge that spelled his end as a crime boss. He was charged with tax evasion after one of his accountants was forced to admit that he'd been hiding money from the IRS. He was also hit with 5,000 counts of violating the Prohibition Act, but he was offered a deal. If he changed his plea to guilty, he would only spend 2.5 years behind bars, and by all accounts he jumped at the chance. But Judge James Wilkerson decided to reject the deal, and Capone had no choice but to stand trial. He was found guilty of tax evasion and sentenced to 11 years in prison, most of which was spent in Alcatraz. But he was released in 1939 when it was discovered that the syphilis that he'd contracted many years earlier had started having an effect on his mental state. Quite unbelievably, he was never charged or convicted of a single violent crime, and according to the FBI file, the tax evasion charge was the only way the government could get him off the streets for good. The declassified FBI file on lawyer and Associate Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States, Abe Fortas, makes for some very interesting reading, since it paints the US Supreme Court in a less than favorable light. These revelations were brought to light by author Alex Charnes in his book, which is entitled FBI Snitches, Blackmail, and Obscene Ethics at the Supreme Court. It details his 13-year effort to gain access to FBI files on Fortas, but at first the agency vehemently denied that any such records existed. But Charnes didn't take no for an answer, and after filing 3 Freedom of Information Act lawsuits, he was finally able to obtain the information that he was looking for. He later stated that he was inspired by the work of Dave Garrow, who served as a mentor and who would go on to win the Pulitzer Prize for his biography of Dr. Martin Luther King and the FBI's involvement in his life. Garrow had obtained the information from his book via a Freedom of Information Act request, and so Charnes was well prepared when he started digging for information on Fortas. When he learned that the FBI had blackmailed King, he assumed that similar threats had to have been made against individuals serving the liberal Warren Court. And so he started his investigation into the U.S. Supreme Court and Chief Justice Earl Warren, but he immediately hit a dead end when the FBI denied having any documentation on Abe Fortas. But he refused to accept this as an answer. He then asked for his own FBI file to be released on him, and this request was granted. Since he'd made so many Freedom of Information requests, the file was more than 1,000 pages long, and inside he found a note titled Left-Wing Law Clerks, which referenced a file on the Supreme Court. He then uncovered allegations by the FBI that Fortas was homosexual, information they garnered from an informant who claimed that he'd been in a relationship with Fortas before he became a justice of the court. Fortas was informed of these allegations by order of Hoover, who claimed that Fortas needed to be aware of these claims for his own protection. Fortas denied the claims, but in 1968, Hoover sent another agent to inform Fortas that he'd been seen at a homosexual bar by an informant. In response, Fortas immediately resigned from the Supreme Court, resulting in many people speculating that he was indeed homosexual, and that he decided to step down since this orientation was seen as unacceptable at the time, and to save his family from the resulting humiliation, were he to oppose the informant's claims. But not everyone is convinced. It was speculated that Fortas was in fact heterosexual and that the entire report was fabricated to force him into resigning from the Supreme Court, and this meant that J. Edgar Hoover was directly responsible for blackmailing a justice of the court, something that was not expected of the director of the FBI. William Berger was appointed as Chief Justice and Harry Blackmun as Associate Justice, leading to rumors that they were the preferred candidates over Fortas, and that the FBI went to unprecedented lengths to ensure that they were appointed in his stead. These rumors have now finally been proven as true thanks to the Freedom of Information Act and declassified FBI file. Declassified CIA documents have left many people surprised when they learned that the agency collaborated with Italian forces and NATO following the Cold War. After the war had ended, the then Italian Prime Minister reported to his Senate that Italy was involved in an operation called Gladio, which translates from Latin as the sword. It involved a stay-behind army, but Italy wasn't the only country that was employing this strategy. Many other stay-behind armies were operating throughout Western Europe, including Denmark's Absalom program, Switzerland's P-26, Norway's ROC, the Netherlands' I&O, and Belgium's SDRA-8. They'd been operating in different areas during the Cold War and served several functions akin to a network of armies that was being coordinated by the Allied Clandestine Committee and the Clandestine Planning Committee. These armies were told to prepare for a Soviet invasion in Western Europe, in which case they would have ruled out their operations from behind enemy lines. If this became a reality, they would set up resistance groups in areas controlled by the Soviets, sabotage supply lines, and help to evacuate pilots who'd been shot down over enemy territories. They were also told to prepare for an emergency situation, and while the emergency is never identified outright, it's thought that this refers to domestic threats posed by civilians who supported communism in their respective countries. The operations carried out by these secret armies often involved criminal activity and subversive tactics, as has been revealed by their released documents. Some examples of this were carried out in Turkey in 1960, during which Adnan Menderes, Turkey's prime minister, was executed. The following year, the French stay-behind army was responsible for an unsuccessful coup against the French government of Algiers, and in 1980, the leader of the stay-behind army in Turkey staged a coup and ultimately gained power in that region. In one of the stranger instances concerning these types of armies, the former leader of the Swiss Stay-Behind Army contacted the U.S. Defense Department and threatened to reveal the truth behind these plots to the world, and he was found deceased the following day after he was attacked with his own bayonet. England's SAS and MI6 have also been involved in creating and establishing stay-behind armies, having done so in 1995 in Western Europe. In 1996, it was reported by the Boston Globe newspaper that more than 80 secret caches of radio equipment, firearms, explosives, and gold were left behind in Western Europe, and that they had become a diplomatic problem for U.S. diplomats and intelligence officers. A week later, the Guardian newspaper revealed that the U.S. military had recruited and trained former SS personnel from Austria, who were then told to guard similar secret caches that had been set up in Austria, and to keep them at the ready in case the Soviet Union decided to stage an invasion. The documents have also revealed that Franz Olah, the former interior minister of Austria, created a stay-behind army with the help of MI6 and the CIA, and that they established communication centers in several areas throughout Austria. These armies were trained to use specialized weapons and to handle explosives that were used during sabotage missions. These armies, according to Olah, contained thousands of soldiers, and their existence was only known to the most powerful politicians and a few members of the Union. Lastly, Operation Gladio also employed what was known as the strategy of tension, during which the stay-behind armies would attempt to sway and control public opinion with the use of psychological operations. During the Cold War, the US and Soviet Union were hard at work trying to get the upper hand over each other, and the CIA was involved in two separate operations, both codenamed Operation Washtub. The first was spearheaded by the FBI and the US Air Force in Alaska with the CIA's support, while the other took place in Nicaragua. The operation in Alaska involved training civilians, many of whom were butchers, miners, priests, and pilots, to remain behind enemy lines in case of a Soviet invasion, and to then acquire information and report on enemy activities. The operation had been suggested many years before it was finally implemented, but on the 27th of January, 1950, it was put into motion. During a meeting that was attended by U.S. Navy Captain Minor Hine and Air Force, Army, and FBI staff, it was suggested that Alaskan locals receive this type of training and that they remain in their respective areas rather than flee if an invasion were to take place. Since Alaska is massive and all areas could not be covered using these stay-behind agents, it was suggested that a network of agents be created and that they act as sleeper agents who would remain inactive until a threat was observed. They would not only be responsible for gathering intelligence, but would also have to create escape routes for any soldiers that became stranded behind enemy lines, thereby ensuring that they could be extracted once they fled from enemy forces. But not everyone was confident that the operation would be successful. Some FBI agents stated that they could envision a few problems, including the fact that too few civilians would volunteer to remain behind enemy lines, and that the Soviets could then identify unprotected areas to invade. Nevertheless, the operation was approved by the head of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover. Once civilian candidates were recruited, they were first investigated to ensure that they'd be reliable. It was then decided that a network of about 130 agents should be placed across Alaska and that they'd be paid $3,000 per year. Training of these agents was carried out by the FBI and CIA, but in 1951, the FBI withdrew from the operation since it wasn't progressing, and the FBI feared that it would end in embarrassment. The second Operation Washtub was conducted in Nicaragua at the beginning of the Cold War. At the time, the Guatemalan president, Jacobo Arbenz Guzman, had come to the attention of the CIA after he vowed to rid his country of foreign dependency. He also stated that Guatemalan land, owned by U.S. corporations, many of which contained banana plantations, would be redistributed, and the U.S. government decided to take action to put a stop to his plans. Hence, Operation Washtub was born. It was by no means the agency's most complicated operation, as it merely required an agent to leave the cache of weapons unguarded off the coast of Nicaragua, and this was done on the 19th of February, 1954. A group of fishermen were then paid to discover this cache and to report the find to Nicaragua's president, Anastasio Somoza Garcia, who was considered friendly by the U.S. government. Garcia then reported the discovery to the media in an effort to make it seem as though Guatemala was in league with the Soviet Union. But unsurprisingly, no one took any notice of the announcement, as most people immediately knew that it was a ruse, and ultimately the operation was considered a failure. Oleg Penkovsky, a member of the Russian Communist Party, has been revealed by declassified CIA documents as a secret agent who worked with the agency during the Cuban Missile Crisis, which lasted for 13 days in October of 1962. During this time, the US and Soviet Union were on the brink of nuclear war after the Soviets installed nuclear missiles in Cuba and then aimed them at several cities in the US. In response, the US created naval blockades around Cuba, stemming the flow of missiles into the country and resulting in a tense standoff between the two forces. The CIA managed to make contact with Penkovsky and struck a deal in which he would provide the US with Soviet military documents, intelligence, and photos in exchange for a better life in the US for him and his family. Once he had acquired such information, he handed it over to Greville Wynne, a British businesswoman who was known to travel to Eastern Europe often to conduct business. Wynne would then travel back to London and hand the information over to MI6 before it was shared with the CIA. Penkovsky was an old hand at military matters, but Wynne had a lot to lose if his mission was ever compromised. If he were caught, he'd be prevented from returning to London and likely face a prison sentence under terrible conditions, and may even have faced execution. Penkovsky managed to steal about 10,000 documents and other types of information, including an operations manual for the SS-4 medium-range ballistic missile that they were using at the time. He also found and supplied information on the military intelligence arm of the Soviet armed forces, including the names of several officers who were involved and the operations that they were carrying out. He was also responsible for bringing the US's attention to a top-secret journal called Military Thought, which they never knew existed. He managed to provide Wynne with a series of articles from the publication, and they were used to analyze the strategies and tactics used by the Soviet Union during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and during operations carried out in the years that followed. While Penkovsky has been hailed as an instrumental part of U.S. intelligence gathering efforts during this time, many historians have stated that his role was actually greatly exaggerated, and in some cases, outright falsified. It's been suggested that he only agreed to aid the CIA because his father had served in the White Russian Army that fought against the Red Army, and that this fact excluded him from being promoted to general. Furthermore, he may have had ulterior motives. It later came to light that he was a big fan of the Queen and of John F. Kennedy, and that he decided to work with the CIA to improve his chances of meeting them, though he never got the chance. He was also found to be emotionally unstable, showed signs of uncontrolled rage as well as vanity. This may have led to his downfall, as he was arrested by the Soviets on the 22nd of October, 1962, after which he attempted to trick the KGB into using his emergency number to contact his CIA handlers. He told his captors that if they called his handler from his emergency number and ended the call as soon as it was answered, the CIA would believe that he was caught in an emergency situation, or that the Soviet Union was about to attack the US. If this had been done, it could have resulted in a nuclear war, further illustrating Penkovsky's unstable emotional state. He was eventually found guilty of treason, and on the 16th of May, 1963, he was executed. Dr. Zhivago is a very well-known film that was released in December of 1965, but the film originated from a book written by Boris Pasternak in 1957. While most of us have at least heard of it, not many people know that it was used by the CIA as a Cold War weapon. The book's protagonist is a man called Yuri Zhivago, and early on we learned that his mother passed away while he was still young, and that he then goes to live with his uncle. He starts studying medicine at a Moscow university, and while there, he and a woman named Tanya fall in love. They eventually get married and have a son named Sasha. Yuri goes to the military, where he serves as a medical officer, and during this time he meets a woman called Laura. He realizes that he's seen her before during 2 traumatic events in her life, and learns that she's married to a soldier named Pasha.
but Pasha has been missing for some time, and Laura explains that she's come to the West to look for him, leaving her daughter Katya behind. Yuri starts to develop feelings for Laura, but when his military service is over, he returns to his family in Moscow. But they struggle to make ends meet and decide that they'll look for a better life on an estate that was once owned by Tanya's grandfather. They undertake an arduous journey to reach the estate, but once there, they are elated to find that there's more than enough food and work. At one point, Yuri visits a library, and as fate would have it, he runs into Laura while there. The pair start an affair, but 2 months later, Yuri's conscience gets the better of him, and he ends it after decoding to confess to Tanya. But before he can do so, he's captured by the partisan army, and he's conscripted as a medical officer until the end of the war. Upon his return, he reunites with Laura, and they decide to hide out in Varakino for a few months. He then learns that his family has been exiled to Paris, and he's told by a man named Komarovsky that he'll be reunited with them if he and Laura follow him to the east. Yuri tricks Laura into going with Komarovsky while he moves to Moscow. Here, he meets a woman called Marina, and they have 2 children together. Then one day, while he's on his way to start a new job, he has a heart attack and passes away. At his funeral, Laura speaks to Yuri's half-brother and asks if he knows of a way to find a child that's been given away. She then vanishes and is presumed to have ended up in a concentration camp. It later comes to light that Laura and Yuri had a child together, and that it was this child that Laura was looking for. In the Soviet Union, the novel was seen as unacceptable, since it contained a less than favorable view of the Bolshevik Revolution. It had an indifferent tone towards socialism and contained intense religious overtones. The Kremlin and Communist Party in Italy did their best to suppress the book, but it was eventually published in Italian, and in 1958, 2 rolls of film containing photos of the novel were sent to the CIA by British intelligence officials. Plans were set in place to have it published in Russian and to have copies of the book sent to Soviet citizens. They knew that the Soviet government would not look kindly on the book's message that every person has a right to freedom regardless of their political view, and that it would likely cause discontent among the public. Pasternak was forced to turn down the Nobel Prize in Literature, since the Kremlin deemed the book to be anti-Soviet. But more than 10 million books and magazines made it into the Soviet Union, including thousands of copies of Dr. Zhivago. Documents relating to the CIA Operation Mongoose have been declassified, but much of the text remains redacted and unknown. The operation was authorized by John F. Kennedy following the failure of the Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961, after which it was determined that Fidel Castro, the then president of Cuba, had to be done away with. Robert Kennedy was placed in charge of the mission. John F. Kennedy was convinced that the Bay of Pigs invasion had failed thanks to leaks in the military and intelligence departments, and felt that only his brother could be trusted with the task. Robert decided that the operation should begin with espionage and chaos being created in Cuba with the use of locals. He believed that the U.S. government had nothing to lose and that they might as well throw everything they had at Castro. Getting rid of Castro had become the U.S. government's top priority, and rather than launch another invasion, it was decided that small covert operations would be carried out. CIA operative Edward Lansdale was chosen by Robert Kennedy to lead these efforts, and he helped establish a $100 million spy base in Miami, Florida. All the while, pressure to do away with Castro was mounting, and so members of the mafia were brought in to help. They hired a hitman called Johnny Roselli to end Castro's life, possibly without the Kennedys' knowledge. He was involved in at least one attempt on Castro's life using poisoned pills, but the plot failed, and he later lost his life, likely at the hands of Chicago mobsters. Lansdale also suggested at one point that the U.S. military send a submarine to the coast of Havana, where it would fire star missiles into the sky in an effort to convince Castro that Christ had returned and that he stood against Cuba. This was seen as a ridiculous suggestion, though, and Lansdale started to lose credibility, though he denied ever hatching this plan. It was then suggested that the Pan American or KLM one-way flight tickets be dropped throughout Cuba, giving its citizens the opportunity to flee to Mexico and simultaneously cause unrest in the country. Other suggestions included spreading faked photos of Castro in the company of 2 beautiful women and a table full of lavish food with the caption, "My portion is different," among the Cuban public, and dropping rolls of toilet paper throughout the country with photos of Castro and Nikita Khrushchev, the then president of the Soviet Union, printed on alternate sheets in an effort to irritate Castro. Eventually, it was decided that Operation Mongoose was unfeasible, especially while it was under Lansdale's control, and it was brought to a halt. The Pentagon Papers, officially called Report of the Office of the Secretary of Defense Vietnam Task Force, were created as a history of the U.S. military's involvement in Indochina, which includes Vietnam, between 1945 and 1986. The papers were created by Robert McNamara, the then Secretary of Defense, and contained as many as 3,000 pages of information, along with about 4,000 pages of appendices. The papers were written over an 18-month period, but as soon as they were completed, military analyst and researcher Daniel Ellsberg decided to do the unthinkable. At first, Ellsberg stood firmly behind the U.S.'s efforts in Vietnam, but as time went by, he was of the opinion that the U.S. was causing more harm than good, and he hatched a plan to have the papers leaked to the media. He sent a copy of the papers to the New York Times, which then slowly started publishing them on the 13th of June, 1971. Members of the public were immediately intrigued, since these documents were known to be top secret, and after the third series of papers was published, the U.S. Department of Justice obtained a restraining order that halted the publication from continuing. For the next 15 days, nothing more was published, but the U.S. Supreme Court then decided that the material could indeed be published, since the government had failed to show why this should not be done. In the New York Times, U.S. citizens read that Harry S. Truman had aided the French military against the Viet Minh, and in doing so, had ensured the U.S. would become involved in Vietnam. The papers also revealed that President Dwight Eisenhower had made the decision to prevent the Soviet Union from taking over South Vietnam, and that he was involved in undermining North Vietnam's communist rule. Furthermore, the American public learned that President Lyndon B. Johnson had ramped up covert operations in North Vietnam, and that he was behind the decision to bomb North Vietnam, despite being told by his intelligence advisors that it would make very little difference as far as support for the Viet Cong was concerned. The papers caused outrage in the U.S., as its citizens had been discontent with the military's continuous war efforts against the country for some time, and these revelations confirmed their suspicions that it was far worse than imagined. Most of the secret papers that have been declassified by the CIA deal with espionage and other activities in foreign countries, but those relating to Operation Chaos, another of the CIA's operations, reveal spy tactics that were used against U.S. citizens during the 1960s. The fact that this was done has caused some controversy, since spying on one's own citizens flies directly against the CIA's charter. But the papers have revealed that then-President Richard Nixon had grown tired of anti-war protests in the U.S., following the U.S. military's involvement in Vietnam. He believed these protests made no sense and stood to undermine his presidency. On one occasion, he described the protesters as anarchists, sweeping across the country like a prairie fire. Furthermore, news of the protests that were being carried out by as many as 250,000 people across the country had made its way to soldiers stationed in Vietnam, and it had started affecting their morale while fighting against the Viet Cong. But Nixon was also paranoid that the protests were being organized by foreign powers, and so he ordered the CIA to create a report on the anti-war movement and to report on any foreign communist support that was being offered to the protesters. During a televised press conference, Nixon stated that he and his government would not be swayed by these protests, and added that the media's coverage of the anti-war effort made it seem as though Washington was in a state of siege. The CIA's role in finding information was dubbed Operation Chaos. Nixon knew that his orders were in direct violation of the CIA's charter, which stated that counterintelligence could only be used on foreign targets, but he chose to ignore this and forged ahead with his plan. The operation began when CIA agents were sent to universities across the U.S. There, they did their best to blend in with the protesters after learning their lingo and adjusting to their culture. Once they were accepted into these groups, they traveled to foreign countries in an effort to find connections to the anti-war effort there. More than 300,000 locals and foreign names were added to a list of possible dissidents, and more than 7,000 U.S. citizens were then thoroughly investigated. Files were created containing the names of their family members, their place of employment, as well as any groups that they were affiliated with. Next, the CIA started intercepting mail that was being sent back and forth between the US and USSR, hoping to find evidence of collusion between dissidents in that region and the anti-war protesters who were being investigated. These efforts continued for years as the CIA did its best to find connections between foreign influencers and the protesters. But when they were able to find such connections, they were tenuous at best. Most of the protesters hadn't been influenced by anyone and had simply come to the realization that the Vietnam War served very little purpose, and that it was needlessly resulting in a massive loss of life on both fronts. Innocent people in Vietnam were left destitute. US and Vietnamese soldiers were losing their lives every day, and by all accounts, no one could see a positive outcome, even if the US was to win the war in the end. In 1969, the CIA finally made it clear that they were unable to find any meaningful connections between the protesters and foreign powers. But Operation Chaos continued for a further 5 years until Nixon resigned in 1974. It's well known that Panama and the US have a long history of collaboration that started with the Panama Canal. Together, these two countries signed treaties that established the canal's functions and that resulted in the canal being controlled by Panama. Since then, the two countries have worked together on coups, secret arms shipments, and even revolutions. But thanks to declassified CIA documents, we now know that two Panamanians worked with the agency against the reign of Fidel Castro in Cuba. The first is Ruben Oscar Miro, a revolutionary lawyer who was friends with and worked with Raul Castro, Fidel's younger brother. It's believed that he became involved with the CIA after helping unknown citizens of the US during a trial that took place in 1940 or 1941. The second was a woman named Thelma King, who was friendly with Fidel Castro and who served as one of his agents at one point. She was a revolutionary politician, but it isn't known how she first made contact with the CIA. In 1970, Richard Nixon had embarked on a trip through Europe, and King was considered a threat. But a year later, she'd relocated to the US and started working with the CIA. According to declassified documents, she was involved in a plot to either kidnap or end the lives of former Vice President Spiro Agnew and Richard Helms, the former director of Central Intelligence. When she learned of John F. Kennedy's assassination on the 22nd of November, 1963, she told her CIA handler, Jake Esterlin, that she believed it to be the work of extremists, but later changed this opinion when she started to believe the assassination was carried out by right-wing extremists in the US police force. While this has never been proven, many people believe that King was involved with the Kennedy assassination, since she was implicated in the assassination of Jose Antonio Ramon Quintero. According to witnesses at the scene, King was present at the clubhouse where his life was ended, and she suspiciously left his box just moments before the first shots rang out. Miro was also implicated in the plot, and he was arrested. He confessed to being one of the assassins, but later recanted that statement and instead implicated the new Panamanian president, Jose Ramon Guisado. Guisado lost his presidency as a result, and Ricardo Arias took over, only for Miro to then withdraw his statements, but only after Guisado's political career lay in tatters. The papers have also revealed that Miro was friends with Frank Sturgis, the burglar in the Watergate scandal, with whom he spent time in Miami. It also came to light that he'd once been involved in a plan to invade Panama with the aid of Raul Castro, but this plan never came to fruition, since it was stopped by Fidel Castro before it could be carried out. These revelations have done little to clear up the confusion as to who these two were allied with. They may have served as double agents against Castro, but it's also been suggested that they were actually acting as triple agents, and that they were working against the US rather than for it. Victor Marchetti, who worked for the CIA for 14 years, became the focus of one of the agency's surveillance projects, codenamed Project Butane. Marchetti worked for the National Security Agency as an analyst for a few months, after which he moved to the CIA in 1955. At first, he was employed as an Office of Research and Reports analyst, but he eventually started working with the Office of National Estimates. In 1966, he moved to the Office of Planning, Programming, and Budgeting. And 2 years later, he became the special assistant to Rufus Taylor, the CIA's then deputy director. Following this 9-month stint, he worked for the National Photographic Interpretation Center's Planning, Programming, and Budget Department, and according to CIA papers, he played a role in setting up the Pine Gap satellite ground station in Australia. After leaving the CIA, he started a career as a writer. He published a fiction book called The Rope Dancer, in which an agent with the fictional National Intelligence Agency decides to start working for the Soviet Union as a spy. While he was promoting his book, Marchetti revealed that he was planning on writing and publishing a non-fiction book on the CIA. He drew the attention of the agency in 1972, when he wrote an article for Esquire magazine, in which he revealed the names of CIA agents, wrote about CIA operations, and discussed the U.S.'s relations with foreign countries. The article was never published, as the CIA had acquired a copy of the draft and filed for an injunction against him, which was then granted. He was ordered to hand over all of his writings to the agency, which were then reviewed before they were published. In 1973, he finished his book, as promised, and submitted it to the CIA before it was published. And 339 pages were found to contain classified information, and Marchetti was ordered to delete them. But he had no intention of doing so, and stated that he would go to court to have the book published as is. The CIA then allowed him to use 171 of the 339 pages, but Marchetti was adamant that the rest also had to be published. The matter went to trial, but Marchetti was ordered to remove the remaining 168 pages. Unsurprisingly, Marchetti became the focus of a surveillance campaign against him, which was named Project Butane by the CIA. During this time, he was investigated so that it could be determined what activities he was involved with and who his contacts were after he left the CIA. It was suspected that he was talking to and gathering information from CIA employees in order to write his book, and it was feared that he would divulge sensitive information that was supposed to be kept from the public. Marchetti stated that he found many of the CIA's activities questionable, such as its love of conducting clandestine paramilitary operations. His concern was that if this wasn't done with great care, it could result in war. He went as far as to claim that the CIA had started private wars in several countries, and had succeeded in disguising these conflicts as being started by that country's civilians. He stated that this is how the U.S. managed to enter the Vietnam War, and that similar tactics were used in Cambodia and Laos. Needless to say, Marchetti became very unpopular with the agency in his later years, but he continued speaking about the CIA's activities until he passed away in October of 2018. With all that we've learned about the CIA, thanks to declassified documents, it comes as no surprise that they have, on several occasions, monitored the activities and writings of journalists whom they deemed to be responsible. This is another instance where the agency chose to ignore its own charter and gather what it considered to be vital information, but the agency deemed it necessary to ensure that vital information didn't fall into the wrong hands. This surveillance, along with other types of illegal activity carried out by the agency, was included on a dossier known as the Family Jewels that was compiled by the CIA at the orders of James Schlesinger, who served as the agency's director at the time. The dossier contained a total of 700 pages and serves as a type of confessional that was kept away from the public for decades. But in 2007, these documents were slowly but surely declassified thanks to a Freedom of Information request. The documents were published on the CIA's website and revealed a mission called Project Celotex, during which a Washington Post reporter, Michael Gettler, was placed under surveillance. He was not only followed around by CIA agents, but they also set up a surveillance point at the Statler Hilton Hotel, from where they could keep an eye on the building where his office was located. The CIA and the White House had become irritated with Statler after he published a series of articles on intelligence, and when he published further articles on arms control talks between the US and Soviet Union, they started to become suspicious of him. The documents state that he'd published a piece in 1970 in which he discussed intelligence disputes over the missile buildup by the Soviet Union, and this came to the attention of Defense Secretary Melvin Laird. Laird contacted Henry Kissinger, who was serving as a national security advisor, and made him aware of Statler's views and writings. He also published a piece in 1971 on CIA patrols that had been conducted in China, which further drew the ire of the agency. But Operation Celotex failed when the Washington Post became aware of the surveillance being conducted, and they provided Statler with a top-flight lawyer to represent him. Statler decided not to go ahead with the proceedings against the CIA, and instead met with the agency's counsel, and they agreed on a cease and desist order, which, if not observed, would have resulted in legal action being taken against the CIA, since they had breached their own charter. But Statler wasn't the only journalist who was placed under surveillance illegally. During Project Celotex II, journalist Jack Anderson and his staff, Britt Hume, Leslie Whitten, and Joseph Spear, were observed between the 15th of February and 12th of April 1972. Anderson had also somehow gotten his hands on classified CIA information and had included some of these details in a few of his articles. He and his colleagues were kept under surveillance 24 hours a day, as it was feared that Anderson would publish information on U.S. military bases that had been established in Japan. The agency stated in these declassified documents that this information was extremely sensitive since Okinawa had been used by the CIA as a logistical hub for its operations at the time. From there, they conducted covert missions, trained soldiers, transported supplies, and coordinated bombing missions against North Vietnam and the countries surrounding it. But as soon as Anderson started suspecting that he was being watched, the CIA aborted the project, having never identified any of his sources. He then became the target of an assassination plot that was ordered by White House aide Charles Colson, but it was abandoned in the wake of the Watergate scandal. In the end, the CIA was only able to ascertain that Anderson drove too fast on occasion, and Operation Celotex II was an unmitigated failure. Many of the files that have been declassified by the CIA contain details of missions carried out by the agency since it was first established, back in September of 1947. Several of these projects were carried out deep in enemy territory, and in some cases involved some very risky strategies that didn't always produce the results that were hoped for. Number 10. At the end of World War II, General Claire Lee Chennault and Whiting Willauer decided to establish an airline called Civil Air Transport in China. At the time, Chennault was the leader of the Flying Tigers, which was the first American volunteer group of the Republic of the China Air Force, while Willauer worked for a company called China Defense Supplies. To acquire planes for their new airline, they purchased war surplus cargo planes and employed veterans who served in the war, many of whom were flying aces from the Flying Tigers and the U.S. Army Air Corps. Much of the airline's work included the transportation of food and medicine to parts of China that had been decimated by the war. Railroads and bridges had been destroyed, making it hard, or in some cases impossible, for residents in these areas to travel to areas where supplies were available. But thanks to backing from the China National Rehabilitation and Relief Association, relief was at last being provided. When it became apparent that the nationalist China would be overrun by Japanese forces, the directors of the country's two airlines, Central Air Transport Corporation and China National Aviation Corporation, decided to abandon Hong Kong and travel to Beijing in hopes that they'd be included in the development of the People's Airline. Then it came to light that their workers were harvesting spare parts from the abandoned planes before loading them onto People's Airline planes, and it was assumed that a paratrooper attack on Taiwan was being planned. But before this could be done, the planes were grounded in Brown's Colony by Willauer, and this likely curtailed any such planned attack. Following this, the CAT airline flew thousands of people who'd lost their homes in the conflict to relocate to Taipei. When they had done all they set out to do, Chennault and Willauer sold CAT to the U.S. government, after which it became the property of the CIA, according to declassified documents. The airline continued to operate as a passenger airline, but clandestinely, the cargo planes were being used to complete sensitive and important missions. In 1952, one of these planes was used during an attempt to rescue Li Chunying, a Chinese nationalist spy who was stationed in Karen province in Manchuria with the use of a newly installed pickup system, but the plane was ambushed and shot down. 2 of the 3 CIA agents aboard survived the crash, with one remaining missing to this day. When the Vietnam War broke out, the airline, still posing as a passenger service, completed missions there and in Southeast Asia. The airline's pilots also served during the French Indochina Revolution, when word got out that the French military didn't have enough pilots, and CIT pilots made up the difference. But they had to undergo a lot of training, since they were tasked with piloting flying boxcars, a type of plane that they were unfamiliar with. The planes provided French soldiers with arms, food, ammunition, and even vehicles while they were out in the battlefield, and played a vital role during that conflict. But by 1959, the media had started becoming suspicious of the airline and was getting ever closer to discovering their secret operations, and so half of the fleet was renamed to Air America. But this was merely a distraction tactic, as those planes were still used to carry out CIA missions until February of 1968, when the political climate in China started to change and the CIA's role in the Cold War shifted. The U-2 spy plane, also known as the Dragon Lady, is perhaps the most famous of its kind ever constructed. The prototype was built in 1955, and the following year, the first completed version took to the skies for the first time. The main purpose of these planes, according to now-released CIA documents, was to provide the CIA with information on electronic emissions and samples from the Earth's upper atmosphere, as they searched for evidence of nuclear weapons testing. They were also flown over the Soviet Union and China during the Cold War, enabling agents to take photos of the areas of interest without being detected. During one mission that took place on the 1st of May 1960, one of the planes was shot down, an incident that resulted in the U-2 affair. At the time, a summit was being planned between the Soviet leaders and those from Western countries, in hopes that the Soviets would agree to lay down their arms. But when the plane, which was being piloted by the CIA operative Francis Gary Powers, was brought down, the summit quickly fell apart, and the Soviet premier, Nikita Khrushchev, abruptly left the meeting after condemning the US and its operations. Powers had taken off from a base in Pakistan and was headed towards Norway, but to get there, he needed to fly over almost 3,000 miles of Soviet airspace, and as he reached the Sverdlovsk Oblast, he was spotted and fired upon, resulting in the plane being grounded. Powers managed to reach the ground safely via his parachute after ejecting from the plane, and he was immediately taken into custody by the KGB. Parts of the crashed plane were put on public display and used to point out to the Soviet people just how devious the US government was. There was now no doubt that the US had been spying on the Soviet Union, despite reassurances from the CIA that the flight was merely a routine weather flight, during which Powers had blacked out due to a lack of oxygen and inadvertently ended up flying over Soviet airspace. But it was then revealed that Powers had made it out of the attack alive, and that he never lost consciousness during his flight. When the plane was found, it still contained its aerial camera system, and it was obvious this was a spy plane. Khrushchev demanded an apology, but the agency refused, pointing out that the Soviet Union had been conducting many of its own spying missions, and further claimed that these missions had to be carried out to ensure the safety of the citizens of the US. He made it clear to Khrushchev that these missions would go indefinitely, and as a result, the Paris summit disintegrated. As for Powers, he was interrogated and put on trial for espionage. After he was found guilty on all accounts, he was sentenced to 3 years in prison, with a further 7 years of hard labor to follow. But he was released in February of 1962, when he and an American student were exchanged for Rudolf Adel, a Soviet spy who'd been captured. As time went by, the U-2 spy plane program became obsolete with the advent of satellite imagery, and together more reliable and safer technologies, and on the 1st of May 1960, the U-2 spy program was officially brought to a close. 1 year before the U-2 spy plane program was halted, the US had started delving into the possibility of using satellite imagery to spy on enemy territories. This was the beginning of the Corona program, which is hailed today as one of the forerunners of modern intelligence gathering. During the Cold War, the US needed to gather as much intel as possible on China and the Soviet Union. And when it became clear that spy planes were becoming too much of a risk, they started considering using satellites instead. Thus started the development of keyhole satellites, to which powerful cameras were attached before being launched into the skies. Since these were panoramic cameras, they could take photos of wide areas, but there was one hiccup that needed to be solved. Since it was impossible for these images to be beamed back to the US, a solution had to be devised by which 70mm film containing the images could be retrieved. Not only did they need to survive the trip back to Earth, but they also had to be kept out of the enemy's hands, which would be no easy task. The solution seemed almost too simple to be true. Each satellite was fitted with a small recovery capsule that comfortably housed the film and could survive the plunge back to the ground through Earth's atmosphere. The satellites would be programmed to take images of a certain area for a specific amount of time, and once this had been done, the recovery capsule would be automatically ejected and sent plummeting through the air. At around 60,000 feet, a small parachute would automatically deploy, slowing the capsule's descent, but this didn't guarantee that it would land where it was intended to, and so a system had to be devised by which they could be retrieved while still in mid-air. Several types of aircraft, including the C-119 flying boxcar and the JC-130 Hercules, were fitted with hooks that could catch the capsules in time. But this was no small feat, since the pilots in charge of these planes had only a very short time to complete the maneuver. If they were unsuccessful, the capsule would plunge into the ocean, where recovery teams did their best to locate it. This had to be done within 48 hours, since the capsules were fitted with salt plugs that would eventually dissolve in the water. If the recovery team was unable to retrieve the photos, the plug would dissolve and the capsule would sink to the bottom of the ocean, safe from enemy eyes. As the Corona program progressed, technology improved, and before long the satellites were fitted with multiple capsules instead of just one. This allowed for the capsules to be dropped in stages, rather than having to wait for the entire film load to be used. As a result, much more information was gathered, and at a faster pace than ever before. But the program wasn't always successful. Since some time passed between the photos being taken and the film being retrieved, the gathered intelligence would sometimes be out of date. For instance, hardware failed, the capsule's parachutes would fail to open, or in some cases they would completely miss their drop points, and the gathered intel would be lost. The program remained in use until 1972, when advanced satellite imagery emerged, and it was found to be more cost-effective than the capsule system. The A-12 Oxcart aircraft was revealed for the first time in 1970, when an article was published in an issue of the Studies and Intelligence academic journal. But this was an internal CIA publication, and hence the public had no knowledge of its existence. The article, which has since been declassified, was written by Thomas P. McKinich, but it's now known that this was a pseudonym used by several different CIA analysts at the time. It stated that the A-12 aircraft was developed after it was discovered that U-2 spy planes were quickly being spotted by Soviet systems. They were able to track them once they were identified, making them all but obsolete. Engineers were tasked with making these planes harder to spot and less susceptible to enemy attacks. The best way to do this was to reduce the plane's cross-sections, making them harder to spot via radar. Radar-absorbing materials were also used, and while they proved to be effective, they didn't completely solve the problem. A study was then conducted to determine how a plane's speed affected its chances of being shot down. And while this probability was never brought down to zero, it was discovered that when a plane was traveling at supersonic speeds, the chances of it being spotted or hit by enemy fire were greatly reduced. Furthermore, the higher altitude at which the plane could fly, the harder it was to engage with, and so efforts were immediately made to develop an aircraft that was able to fly at supersonic speeds while at very high altitudes, while equipped with radar-absorbing materials. The US government started working with Lockheed and General Dynamics' Convair division. who, from 1957 to 58, did their utmost to refine the plane's design while ensuring that it would function as intended. Once the designs were finalized that year, Project Oxguard got the go-ahead. The Lockheed design was chosen as the most effective, and after studies on aerodynamics, anti-radar capabilities, and the plane's structure were completed, it was decided that 12 of the new planes should be built. When the plane's engine was completed, it was capable of reaching Mach 3, though it was later refined and could reach speeds of up to Mach 3.2. The Perkin-Elmer Company was in charge of developing the onboard cameras, though Eastman Kodak was tasked with developing backup cameras in the event that the first one should fail. The inertial navigation systems and automatic flight controls were designed by Minneapolis Honeywell Corp., and pilot equipment, including life support devices, were created and supplied by the Firewell Corp. But there was still one problem that had to be addressed. When an aircraft flies at such massive speeds, the metal that it's made up of heats up to around 550 degrees Fahrenheit, and so it was decided that a titanium alloy would be used. The camera window, weight of the craft, aerodynamics, and many more factors had to be ironed out before the plane was finally ready to take to the skies. And on the 30th of April, 1962, it finally made its first flight. The plane was used in many clandestine intelligence-gathering missions, and continued to do so for more than a decade without the public ever being aware of its existence. The CIA's Project Cold Feet started in May of 1961, when an aircraft belonging to the U.S. Navy was flying over the Arctic during a routine aeromagnetic survey of the area. The crew aboard the plane spotted something out on the ice, and they decided to investigate. Upon closer inspection, they discovered it was a Russian naval drift station that had been left abandoned, and they immediately reported their finding to their superiors, since they knew they'd been handed a unique opportunity. During an earlier meeting, Navy Lieutenant Leonard Leshak had suggested that if U.S. soldiers were somehow able to land on one of these abandoned drift stations, they would be able to gain access to it and find valuable information. One concern that the U.S. military had was whether or not the Russians possessed the technology to track submarines that were traveling below the surface of the water, and one sure way to find out would be to enter one of their drift stations. Leshak was already familiar with the topic since he'd aided in setting up acoustic detectors in the area, but he knew that Russian forces might possess superior systems that could track U.S. submarines, though it had not been confirmed by this point. The decision was made to send soldiers to the abandoned station in a mission called Project Cold Feet. Captain John Cadwallader was placed in charge of the operation, and he suggested that a newly designed piece of equipment called a skyhook be used during the mission. The skyhook was created by Robert Fulton, who'd been looking for a way to exfiltrate soldiers and civilians who'd become trapped behind enemy lines without the need to land an aircraft in dangerous territories. After conducting several experiments involving weather balloons and weights, he designed the device, which was able to drop off and pick up packages discreetly without the need for the plane that was carrying it to land. A harness and rope, which was connected to a balloon, would be lowered to the trapped individual, after which they would attach the harness to themselves. Once this was done, they would tug on the rope, causing the balloon to inflate. The plane would be guided towards a marker that had been placed on the rope, and once the plane was close enough, a spring-loaded mechanism would activate. This would cause the rope to detach from the balloon and attach to the plane instead. Once the rope was pulled tight, soldiers aboard would use a hook to secure the rope to a winch, which would then pull the person aboard to safety. In one of the experiments that he carried out beforehand, he used a pig as a human analog, and while the animal was rescued successfully, it had spun around uncontrollably while being winched up, and once it regained its composure aboard the plane, it was so annoyed that it started attacking the crew. But when the actual mission was attempted, it was discovered that the drift base had floated too far away, and a second abandoned base was located. On the 28th of May, 1962, 2 soldiers were dropped at the site, and they were able to infiltrate the base, after which they were successfully extracted. In 1985, a British intelligence agent named Oleg Gordievsky had been fully accepted as legitimate by the KGB in Russia, and he'd received a promotion to the chief of that very agency. No one was any the wiser that he was in fact working as a double agent for MI6, and that he'd been doing so for more than a decade. To make his new title official, he was told to report to Moscow as soon as possible, since he was meant to meet up with two of the KGB's highest-ranking officials. But something about the order felt off, he would later explain. He'd been to the KGB's headquarters just a few months earlier, at which time nothing seemed out of place. But in this instance, he had suspicions that one of the agency's counter-spies had somehow found out about his role. He had two choices. He could either report to the headquarters as ordered, in which case he'd be risking being fully exposed and likely executed, or he could simply refuse to attend the meeting, which would mean the end of his career. He shared his concerns with his superiors at MI6, and they assured him that he was overreacting, since they hadn't picked up anything unusual. Gordievsky decided to attend the meeting, but he was provided with an emergency escape plan in case his suspicions turned out to be accurate. His fears were very understandable, since several US and British spies had been exposed in the months leading up to the meeting, many of whom never made it out alive. Those who weren't executed were thrown into prison, where they had to endure harsh conditions and mistreatment. Gordievsky forged ahead with the plan, and as soon as he reached Moscow, he was certain that he was in trouble and that he'd made the wrong decision. When he reached his apartment, he realized that the third lock on the door had been locked, which was impossible, since he'd lost the key and hence couldn't lock it himself. He believed this meant someone had been in the apartment, and realizing that they couldn't lock all the locks on the door, had a key made, after which they then mistakenly locked it. He had no choice but to break into his own apartment, but he was certain that this was the least of his problems. For the next few days, he heard nothing from his superiors, but then Viktor Grushko contacted him and accompanied him to a KGB facility, which was located in a country cottage. Once they arrived, he was given a few sandwiches to eat, along with some brandy, which, unbeknownst to Gordievsky, had been laced with an unknown substance. When he woke up, he was sitting on one of the beds in the cottage, and a KGB general who was in attendance told him that he'd confessed to being a spy while under the influence of the substance. He was told to confess once again, but he refused. He was then taken back to his apartment, but the following morning, Grushko arrived and told him that they knew he was a double agent. He was told that he'd not be allowed to return to England, and that he would continue to work for the KGB in a non-sensitive role. But he hadn't forgotten about his secret escape plan. When he opened them, they explained that he was to travel to a certain street in Moscow on a certain day, where he would find a British-looking man eating an unspecified piece of food. He followed these instructions, but never saw the man, and only on his second attempt did he spot the man who was carrying a Harrods store bag and eating a candy bar. A day was set for his rescue, and when it arrived, he walked through the streets in an unidentified pattern to throw anyone who might be following him off his path. He caught a train and a few taxis to a predefined location near the Finnish border, where he was told to wait in a patch of long grass until two vehicles arrived. He was then picked up by British agents who told him to hide in a specially created compartment in one of the vehicles. They then drove across the border after passing through several checkpoints, and at one point were stopped by Russian soldiers and their dogs, but the agents fed the dogs potato chips and the car was never searched. Gordievsky had successfully escaped, and later was sentenced to death by the Soviet military, but he continued to work with MI6 for many more years, and even published a book about the KGB in later years. To this day, the CIA's Project Rubicon, which was carried out during the Cold War, is considered to be the most successful intelligence heist of the 20th century. The target of the operation was Crypto AG, a Swiss coding machine manufacturer that was associated with more than 60 of the world's governments at the time. The US military partnered with the German intelligence agency, known as the BND, after which it was decided that they should purchase the company. But this could not be done publicly, since each of these two governments wanted to gain access to the codes belonging to their enemies. And so Project Rubicon was born. The founder of the company, Boris Hagelin, and William Friedman, a cryptologist with the NSA, first devised the plan after they'd agreed in 1953 to no longer sell any of the company's premium products to non-allied countries. Instead, non-Western countries could only buy inferior coding machines that had gone out of date by this point, and which were easy to crack. Furthermore, any Crypto AG customer details were to be transferred to the NSA. No formal agreement was ever set up, but both sides held up their end, despite the fact that the relationship between Hagelin and the NSA had started to deteriorate. The agency had refused to share non-essential information with him, and Hagelin had started to grow tired of the restrictions that had been placed on the sale of his machines. By the end of the 1950s, the NSA decided to step away from the deal, after which the CIA stepped in. It was decided that the company would be purchased by the BND and CIA, since they both had massive interests in intercepting communications from threatening countries. Codes used by the inferior machines had been sold to countries in Africa, the Middle East, and Latin America, which were easily deciphered with their owners being none the wiser. Whenever a client started to grow suspicious, they would be sent an upgraded machine to put their minds at rest, but these had been fitted with hidden weaknesses that made them no more secure than they were before. Operation Rubicon ran until 2018 when Crypto AG was sold once more, but by this time, the CIA and BND had gathered a wealth of information on many different countries in one of their most successful operations in history. Declassified CIA documents have revealed that during the Cold War, the U.S. military used pigeons and ravens in some of their spy missions during a program that was named Takana. At the time, it was suggested that the CIA could make use of certain animals during their secret operations. One of the first instances of this involved training a raven to recognize and follow a flashing red laser beam. The beam would be trained on an object that the raven had to collect, and once it had done so, a different lamp would be turned on, and it would follow this light back to the intended destination. In one instance, a raven was used during a live operation in which it dropped an eavesdropping device on a windowsill. And while no audio could be heard after it was delivered, the concept had been proven. This was not the first time that pigeons were trained in this manner. During World War I, they'd proved successful at gathering intel when needed, and during the Second World War, they were successfully utilized by the British intelligence service. But Operation Takana was far more advanced. During the Second World War, pigeons merely dropped questionnaires over Europe that were returned to the UK after being filled out. But during the Cold War, their role was far more involved and important. They were fitted with miniature cameras that were strapped to their chests. Following this, they were sent out to fly over specific areas such as buildings of interest or naval yards, while the cameras captured high-resolution photos. The pigeons were perfect for this role, since they were known to have unique homing skills that allow them to fly hundreds of miles, only to return to a specific location where the intel could then be gathered and processed. In some areas, agents couldn't risk attempting any kind of reconnaissance or intelligence gathering, and so the pigeons were the perfect substitute, since they would likely not be noticed, and if they were, very little could be done about it. Furthermore, the cameras that they carried were state-of-the-art at the time and could take contiguous images, which means that the border of one photo would be lined up perfectly with the next, covering a large area in great detail. But Operation Takana did have a few issues. Not all of the pigeons were as reliable as was hoped, and on some occasions, they simply wouldn't return. The cameras, while being technologically advanced, would on occasion stop working, as with most electronic devices, in which case that particular flight had to be repeated or abandoned altogether. At the same time, the CIA was using dolphins to deliver and pick up packages and sensors in the ocean, and when the enemy was none the wiser. Many of these missions, and those undertaken by the Ravens, were successful, and are seen as landmarks in the agency's ongoing bid for intelligence gathering. Operation Takana continued for several years into the 1970s, until the use of pigeons for this purpose became obsolete. Project FF, an operation run by the CIA, according to declassified documents, started in the 1950s when the US decided that it wanted King Farouk of Egypt to institute certain political reforms in his country. Attempts had been made to insert an American agenda into Egypt in the past, but all these failed, and in 1953 it was decided that this had to be rectified. It was decided that a revolution should be started in the country, in hopes that the corrupt political climate would change to one where a dictator and the king would be more open to American ideals and influence. While many people in Egypt were suffering from poverty, King Farouk lived in luxury, and to this day it's said that he ate as many as 600 oysters a day. His lavish lifestyle drew the ire of his own subjects, and in the minds of the public, he was inept and unfit to rule. Changes to his policies were suggested, but the king remained stubborn in his stance and refused to cooperate. Realizing that this needed to change, Kermit Roosevelt Jr. met with members of the Free Officers Movement, a group of revolutionaries in the Egyptian army that stood firmly against the king. Together, they arranged for a coup to be carried out against Farouk, with Mohammed Naguib and Gamal Abdel Nasser placed in charge of the operation. The free officers were eager to participate since they'd been conspiring against the king for some time, and Project FF provided them with the perfect opportunity to do so. On the 23rd of July, 1952, the coup was carried out and the king was finally overthrown, ushering in the beginning of the revolution the country desperately needed. The CIA and other U.S. agencies provided support throughout, and later established Egypt's intelligence agency, which was closely modeled on the CIA. While these files have been declassified and are readily available to the public, much of the information on the CIA and the rest of the US's involvement in Egypt in the years following Project FF still remains secret. What is known is that the CIA and the Free Officers Movement did not part ways following the successful operation. Furthermore, the coup not only aided Egypt, but also influenced other nearby countries to stand up against corrupt officials and leaders. But problems soon followed. The UK and France were highly suspicious of Egypt's sudden change and newly acquired political stance, resulting in tensions between those two regions and Egypt. These tensions would eventually reach a boiling point and resulted in the Suez Crisis that took place in 1956, and resulted in Egypt being invaded by France, Britain, and Israel. It was an ill-fated attempt, though, as Egypt emerged as the victor, having gained control over the Suez Canal. But the project did have many positive outcomes. The revolutionary government immediately started industrialization programs and sought to improve the country's crumbling infrastructure. Thanks to these projects, Egypt's economy was soon modernized, and the country no longer relied as heavily on aid from foreign countries as it had in the past. Declassified information on the CIA's Project Grudge makes for some very interesting reading, since it deviates from the norm. While many of the now public CIA papers have to do with the Cold War and spy operations, Project Grudge was an entirely different undertaking, since it dealt with the existence of extraterrestrials. 1947 is considered a landmark year for UFO sightings in the US. It's the same year that the infamous Roswell incident occurred, and surprisingly, thousands of reports were later received from members of the public, who stated that they had witnessed strange disc-shaped craft in the sky at night. The US Air Force decided to conduct an investigation under the codename Project Sign. This came about after the release of the Twining Memo, which was authored by General Nathan F. Twining, and which contained the following information. He stated that the UFO phenomenon was not a figment of anyone's imagination, and that these sightings needed to be investigated. He also added that while he considered most disc-shaped object sightings to be real, some could be explained by natural phenomena, such as meteors that had entered Earth's atmosphere. He then pointed to the fact that these craft were seen accelerating at impossible rates and completing maneuvers that had never been seen before. When they were approached by man-made planes, they sped away, leading him to believe that the craft were either being piloted manually or controlled remotely. Thus, Project Sign was created in 1947, and it continued until 1949, when Project Grudge was implemented in its stead. Though it's never been officially confirmed, many people believe Project Grudge was created as a direct result of a document called Estimate of the Situation, in which it was suggested that these discs were created and possibly flown by extraterrestrial beings. But declassified information shows that Project Grudge was always meant to debunk the suggestion that extraterrestrials were responsible, and that the name was specifically chosen for that reason. The guidelines of the operation stated that an investigation was to be carried out using standard intelligence procedures, but we now know that this was not the case. Investigators would, under these procedures, remain completely unbiased, but from the start, it became clear that they would do whatever it took to disprove the existence of these beings, even if it meant falsifying information along the way. Edward J. Ruppelt was originally in charge of the famous Project Blue Book, and stated that investigators were told, no matter what you see or hear, don't believe it. Many intelligence experts who'd worked on Project Sign were removed from Project Grudge, since they were more interested in uncovering the truth than denying the existence of extraterrestrials. High-ranking officials in the military spread the opinion that the UFO phenomenon was nothing more than the figments of the public's imaginations, and as a result, any findings and paperwork that were produced were filed improperly. To dissuade the public from believing in these beings, the US government took to the media to spread misinformation. First, a two-part article was published in the Saturday Evening Post. The author, Sidney Shallett, claimed that the media had blown reports of these crafts out of proportion, and that most of these sightings were the result of either lies told by the public or misidentification of common objects, such as weather balloons. The aim of the project was to dampen the public's interest in the subject, but since some cases could not be explained, it had the opposite effect. And today the entire operation is seen as a farce, since it failed in every one of its objectives. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But my name is Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.